Welcome to another episode of Safe Space, the podcast for next generation family business leaders. Today we're joined by Megan Gerhardt out of Ohio. Megan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So, Megan, before we get started, maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience. Tell them a little bit about you, the amazing work you do, and the book you've written.
Sure. So my name is Megan Gerhardt. I am a professor of leadership at Miami University in Ohio. That's the part that's a little confusing. I am author of the book Gentelligence, A Revolutionary Approach to Leading an Intergenerational Workforce. And really all of my work is centered around how to help organizations have smarter intergenerational conversations. So pushing back on stereotypes and generalizations and getting into the really fascinating challenge and opportunity of how we can collaborate better across ages. So that's all of the work that I do is really, across industries, across different parts of the world. All organizations seem to have this challenge. And so love just learning a little bit about how that shows up for different people in different ways and seeing how we can help make it more productive.
So let's talk about, Gentelligence. I love how you've coined that phrase, right? Communication is difficult as it is between human beings, let alone between generations. So maybe can you share a little bit about, what are some of the things that get in the way of the different generations, the communication styles, what matters, and then, what can we do about it? So let's just start there about the differences.
Sure. So as I said, I think one of the challenges we traditionally have had when we talk about generations is we're very quick to try to make it as simple as possible. So that's where we get those awful generational infographics or those slides you see in training where people say, this is your generation, these are the years you're born. And then they give you, the 3 formative events of your life, and therefore the 2 or 3 ways that everyone in your generation acts and behaves, or things that they all are looking for. And so Gentelligence specifically pushes against that. We want to stay away from assuming all of our generations are a monolith. So I'm really careful to say that we don't want to make something complicated simple. But that said, we certainly can learn a lot by looking at what I like to call generational norms. So norms are a much better place than stereotypes to start, I think, because a norm simply says, this frequency of behavior or a certain way of thinking or a certain experience that shaped us was much more common in my generation than my parents or my kids' generation. So we're not insisting every person around my age had that experience or thinks or feels that way. But as we look at those norms and how they ebb and flow over time, it can be a very helpful lens to understand why we're experiencing some of those differences. So I like to lead with that. And then for your question around communication, I really think the best way to think about intergenerational communication is similar to cross-cultural communication. So I consider generations to really be a form of culture. So you're talking about people who grew up differently than you, had a different set of lived experiences, went through the world at a unique period in history. And as a result, they most likely have a different way of seeing the world, maybe different language, different way of reaching out, different ways they interpret things. And I think most people very much understand that when we travel to another culture, we have a high likelihood of being misunderstood or misunderstanding what's going on because we're using our own norms. And so I believe most of us, first of all, travel because that's interesting, right? So if we could start thinking about intergenerational interactions as interesting rather than just irritating, that would help. And second of all, I think we work a little harder to avoid those kinds of misunderstandings. So if we take that back to generations, I think it's more about asking really smart questions to check for our assumptions, to check whether I'm thinking about this concept in the same way you are, whether we might be getting wires crossed, rather than just, rolling ahead and assuming that when we talk about things like flexibility or development or success, that we all have the same anchor and the same concept of what that means. I think that's the root of a lot of communication struggles. So rather than generalize how each generation thinks about those things, Gentelligence is really about how do we how do we check for that understanding and pause when we feel like maybe we are getting some wires crossed, and have that sort of check for alignment before we move ahead and end up maybe ending up somewhere that isn't where we intended.
So you talk about generational norms. Can you give a couple of examples of some of the norms you're referring to?
Sure. So I love talking about, when you were growing up and the time and place you grew up, there were sort of societal norms or ideas about, for example, what success meant. What would it mean to be successful? Who was successful? And of course, there's lots of layers to our identity. So that could mean something different depending on the part of the world you're in. But if I just take, where I'm sitting right now, if I was a baby boomer when I was, coming of age and starting my life and my career, there was a lot of societal conversation and almost pressure around the idea of material wealth, of climbing that corporate ladder and making partner or getting that corner office or buying that big, beautiful house. And that norm came largely from the fact that the parents and grandparents of the baby boomers had just been through so much chaos, economic, political, World War II, the Great Depression, all of those things that we think about, really hadn't had the chance to build that kind of wealth and stability, and had a lot of hope that the next generation, which would be the baby boomers here in the US and in Canada and some other places, would seize those opportunities. And therefore, success meant you were of a certain status of an organization. You had achieved a certain amount of wealth. And maybe my favorite example of this was the popularization of the word workaholic during the time that baby boomers were starting their career. So a workaholic was sort of a badge of honor. I'm very important. I have a lot of work to do. I'm in demand constantly. Therefore, I am successful. And if we go to, let's say, my generation, Gen X, the generation after the baby boomers, many of us grew up at a time when that sort of workaholic tendency for our parents was in full play, because of the fact that more women at that time in history were able to suddenly be able to work outside the home because of developments in that area. We had more young people in my generation that got to experience independence at a very young age. We call those, that's that stereotype or that sort of trope of the latchkey kid, the Gen X latchkey kids. And I wasn't one. My mom stayed home with me, so that's why I always say I don't go for stereotypes. But I sure knew a lot of friends that were, and we had empty houses to hang out with. Parenting norms of that time were not such that we were really supervising our children. When they got to school age, they had a lot of freedom. And it really did contribute to a norm for that generation of independence and autonomy and self direction that was much higher than the baby boomers had experienced, because many had mom as a default home with them. And actually, quite interesting, it was a much stronger norm for independence for young people than any generation since has
Hmm.
had, because we went quickly to daycare and play dates and lessons and enrichment for that next generation, the millennial generation. Um, Whereas Gen X didn't have that. So, I could land on that for 20 minutes, but I think that's a good snippet of the fact that my generation had a strong norm for wanting to be independent and autonomous, and that being a big part of our definition of success. And that, in contrast to the baby boomers' definition of success, as a norm, is quite significant. It's quite different. And of course, as you can imagine, or maybe you remember, that caused a little bit of tension when Gen X first entered the workplace. So that's, I think, a good example. And of course, we can follow that same pattern for every generation that comes of age. The norms are a little different, and that creates a little bit of tension, or sometimes a lot of tension, when those norms rub up against each other.
So let's talk about the norms of the next generation, the millennials. What are their norms? What defines, what sort of contributes to who they are?
So, the millennial generation, largest generation in the workplace right now. Largely, millennials are the children of the mid to younger baby boomers. Depends on the age of your parents, right? But it's roughly true. And the biggest shift, we know lots of things about millennials that we've heard a lot. The digital natives, all those things you've heard a million times. But I really like to go back to that narrative around, in one generation, we went from the Gen Xers who were, the idea was if you're old enough to go to school, you're old enough to take care of yourself for a few hours after school and not burn the house down. And when mom and dad get home from work, they're home from work. And children were really meant to be seen and not heard. That had been a norm for a very long time. They weren't the main characters in the family. And the biggest shift we saw with the millennial generation, and this is more true for high socioeconomic families than low, which I always like to kind of, make sure I temper my narrative here a little bit, was the younger baby boomers really, if you think about how baby boomers were charged with creating future generations of success for their families, the millennials were largely that next generation. So if you think about baby boomers kind of cracking the code on conventional material success and then having children, this idea of what would be possible for that next generation if we started early. What could we possibly create or invest in our children to allow them to be even more successful than we were? A very well-intentioned, I think, investment. So this idea of paying attention to the talents and the potential and the needs of children at a younger age than we ever had fundamentally changed so many things. It happened that suddenly we were enrolling kids in lessons at age 2, 3, 4, mommy and me and itty bitty soccer and little minnows swim club and all these things designed to really develop their potential and invest in them. And in many families, what ended up happening was children really became the center of that family. So resources and time and schedules and taxiing kids around. And think of the 180-degree change from children sort of being in the background, should be seen and not heard. And so, again, it's a norm because that's not true for every millennial, but it was true for a lot more young people in that generation than in my generation. And with that came more education, more development, but also more pressure and competition. So the millennial definition of success was often like hustle and get to the front. Like, you're worth it. You're going to accomplish more than anyone ever has. You can do it. It led really quickly to some of those tropes around being entitled, right? When millennials showed up and wanted to work, and they wanted to kind of start maybe a couple steps ahead on the ladder than prior generations, it made sense because they had been, in leadership opportunities and sports and arts and music and having multiple internships, whereas I was barely off the couch. When I was a high school student and then a college student, there was not that much expected of us until it was time to go work. And suddenly that bar had been moved. And so when millennials showed up ready to kind of make good on that investment and hustle their way to that, that prize they had been promised, we as a whole, older generations did not like it, right? We got kind of crappy and we were like, who do you think you are? You need to sit down. You just got here. And that led to that entitled. Entitled is the word that when I do keynotes or workshops, my clients will automatically, when I say, what word do you think of when you think millennial, they say entitled. And when I say, what do you think of when I say Gen X, they say slacker, right? And those aren't that different. It sort of means you're showing up and asking for something that I don't think you should have, or you want what I have, but you're not willing to do what I had to do to get it. And that cycle continues with every generation. So, I think the millennial generation was really promised that the hustle would pay off, but I'm not sure for many millennials if they found that to be true. And so, I love sort of that narrative by sort of holding the line and saying it's not every person, but we certainly saw that increase and sort of be part of the culture at that particular point in history.
So after the millennials, it's the Gen Zs.
Correct.
So tell us about their norms.
Well, that's a developing story because their age, depending on the ages we use, so roughly 13 to 28, depends on the culture we are in and those types of things. But the most accepted cutoff, 13 to 28. So I'll talk about the adult Gen Zs, I think, because I always want to sort of wait and not outkick my coverage on the younger ones. But we're just seeing that now. If you think about I always say those norms and this narrative should hopefully help us do the Gentelligent think of always realizing there's a why. Why are we feeling a generational difference? Well, let me stop and think about it. So I think with Gen Zs, we can point to a lot of things. Of course, the pandemic is the elephant in the room. What does it mean to be in your most formative years during a global pandemic and the lockdown of the world? And depending on how old a Gen Z was, they might have lost high school years, college years, just been hired for their first job and or start a first job and never meet any of their coworkers or their management in person. That was certainly true for a lot of my students. So that we can't ignore. How does something like that impact your norms around risk, around mental health, work-life balance? That's really interesting. Certainly, again, things like fake news. So, when I was growing up, there was the news. I don't know if it was accurate, but it was really consistent. So there was no confusion. We were all on the same page. And social media, all of the things that have led them to be skeptical of authority, skeptical of information, but also interestingly put a very high priority on things like authenticity, values. I think because they're so used to that not being present. I think they know what they see online is often a facade. And so all of those things together, I point to, and this is US specific, but there's a version of this lots of places. Also, the accommodation generation. We moved, starting with the millennials and into Gen Z, particularly in the US, lots and lots of efforts to accommodate challenges in school, whether those are mental, physical, learning challenges, which is excellent, but very tough when you go from being a student to being a professional, and what a reasonable accommodation is changes very quickly. And the accommodations that maybe adults have made for you for most of your life are now suddenly not considered reasonable, or they're not things that those generations of professionals were ever allowed to ask for when they were at your life stage. And so, in terms of what success means, I ask these questions a lot because I get to work with this generation all the time. Those are the age of my students. I would say we're seeing very clearly that work-life balance is very much a priority, much similar to Gen X. We're seeing that pendulum kind of swing back, that success is not just the job or the title or the salary, but taking care of yourself kind of as a whole person, which you can see growing up during a global pandemic, how that might track. I'm right in the middle of doing a super interesting research project around how mental health expectations from employers are shifting for Gen Z, how they believe an employer should have to care about your wellness, and do things to help support your well-being. Maybe most interesting, and I'll end here because there's a lot of things we could talk about, but we just analyzed some data that showed that younger generations believe the responsible thing to do if your mental health is not good is to stay home. Whereas baby boomers and Gen Xers very clearly said the responsible thing to do if you're struggling personally is to go to work. So that's probably the most profound thing I can say is both of those are coming from a place of wanting to be responsible and respectful, but the norm around what that means is fundamentally different. And that is why I'm so busy. And that is why, this is an endlessly fascinating topic, I think.
Okay, so we've talked about, four generations and their norms and how those norms, let's say, shape them and mold them. So when you look at a family enterprise or a family system, there's a high probability it's going to be those four generations in the system operating at once. Okay. How can we help them be respectful of each other, appreciate each other, and learn how to collaborate and co-create with such a difference in norms? Because we look at the baby boomers, the Gen X's, the millennials, the Gen Y's. There's some vast differences here, and we can understand why. Based on what they grew up with. So how can we assist them to really say, this is you and this is me, and yes, we've got our differences, and how can we co-create regardless of our differences without blaming each other, saying, oh, you're just a workaholic and you're just lazy, but how can we prevent that from happening?
So I think first and foremost, we've laid this foundation that if we're willing to say, well, I can understand why your thoughts or your perspective on this is different. That's the first thing. Because if I understand there's a reason, it becomes a little harder to judge that. It doesn't necessarily make it easier. Like you said, we have to have strategies like, okay, great, I understand it. It makes more sense to me now that we've paused to think about it. But that doesn't help us in that meeting, right? That doesn't necessarily give us the solution. So we have 4 practices we talk about in our book. And we can get into them whatever level you want. But the common thread I always say is you have to really think about the fact that particularly when we're talking any organization, but particularly for our purposes, the family business, the goal is that we remember we're all on the same side of that tug of war rope. We get in a lot of difficult situations generationally when it becomes an us versus then or a then versus now, which is very, very easy to do because I like my norms. My norms make sense to me. They came from a place that absolutely, is valid. They've worked well for me. And so if you come in and you have different ones, of
And
course,
and Megan, if I may interrupt, they form part of my identity, right?
absolutely.
And one of the greatest addiction all humans have is to their identity. So we're going to fight for that.
Absolutely. And it's very hard not to feel when someone else, you can love them and they're a core member of our family and our organization, but when their norms are different than ours, it it can be threatening. And threat and fear are at the heart of any time we sort of double down and say, well, I'm not comfortable. I'm going to get defensive because I feel like my value to this organization is at risk.
Right.
And so, the cover of our book has this sort of tug of war where, the media paints us as being in constant generational battle all the time. It can feel like that. But I always say to my students, I'm 2 generations away from my students now. So I always say, I am on the same side of this rope as you. Our challenge, our learning, our goals are on the other side. If you ever feel like I'm pulling against you, then we need to stop and have a conversation because we're supposed to be on the same side of this. And the reason I think that's really important is that if I am on the same side of the rope as you and our challenge, our success, our competition is over there, then the fact that you grew up in a different time than me and your view on this, your strategies, what makes sense to you, how you would do it is different than my own, that could become valuable and an asset rather than a threat. But if you're on the other side, you're on the other team, now I'm threatened, I don't like it, I'm not comfortable. So I think that's really, really important. And part of Gentelligence is saying, and we have research to back this up, is saying that sort of age diversity. So in this sort of microcosm of a family business, there is a built-in talent potential that we often waste because we end up on those 2 different sides of the rope. So research shows that an age diverse organization can be incredibly beneficial to performance, retention, engagement, innovation, all the things we know we need to create and the if lies in the culture we create. If the culture is one where every age, older, younger, in between, believes their age allows them to add unique value, that my ideas as a 48-year-old are appreciated as unique and important, just like my 77-year-old father and my 20-year-old son, then that's part of that age inclusive culture. If I have the opportunity to learn and develop at all stages of my growth in life, it's not just something that happens when you first get here. If I get to ask for help, even if I'm 70 or if I'm 17 or I'm somewhere in the middle, all of those things predict whether age is an asset or it's a hindrance. So part of it is, are we creating a culture where everyone believes they have the permission to teach and the permission to learn? And if the answer is no, older people are supposed to know everything and younger people aren't supposed to speak, we've lost that opportunity and that potential. The key is really creating a culture where, regardless of age, everyone feels like they can ask for help and everyone feels like they can contribute something of value, even if their perspective is different. Because we want that. That's what talent potential is, right? Different perspectives. And I think in terms of how we do that, and maybe we can explore this next, is the idea of, I want to enter into conversations where we step away from mine versus yours and then versus now into, okay, we have an understanding of where we're both coming from. Now let's talk about what's going to be our shared norm and standard here in this business
Yeah.
that doesn't belong to
Yes.
you and it doesn't belong to me. It's one that we're co-creating together.
Yes. And as we tell the families we work with, before we can have those conversations, it's important that we create a culture of what we call safe space. Have to be able to feel emotionally safe speaking my truth, my thoughts, my feelings, and my beliefs without fear of being ridiculed, judged, or just not listened to. So once we've created the safe space, we can have these conversations. And as we're having these conversations, to your point, we can start to say, okay, what's the culture we want to create for this entity collectively as a group, not a me versus you, young versus old, incoming versus outgoing. It is collectively, we're co-creating this culture.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about how, you've got these four very distinct generations based on their norms. How can they co-create a culture using their individual norms, appreciating each other's, and creating a new norm for the culture?
So I love the use of questions. I'm going to give you a few of the power questions we've developed around all of our practices. So let's take the idea that you, as a family business, are tackling a sticky, hard problem. For example, perhaps the topic of the moment is, are we going to integrate AI? How are we going to integrate AI? Should we do
Great one.
that? How do we do it without losing our soul, right? The
Yeah,
conversation every business is having at the moment.
100%.
So I had a conversation about this in my classroom, which is a multi-generational organization. And I had lots of thoughts, right? I have thoughts as a Gen Xer. I have thoughts as the leader of the classroom. I have my own experiences to bring into it. But first and foremost, I recognize that my thoughts and my experience with this is likely different than that of the 20 somethings sitting in on the other side. I also realize that the threat that something like that maybe poses to me, somebody 10 or 12 years from retirement, is very different from the role it's playing as somebody's finishing their career, their education, and feeling like maybe their jobs are going to be at risk. So I simply start with the power question. How would you approach this? So if my question is, how should we ethically integrate AI into what we do in here, or should we at all? I, as the older person in the room, and this actually works both ways, but let's take older to younger first. Lead by example and say, given this is really complicated and there isn't one answer, I'm really interested in how you would approach it. If you got to decide, what are your ideas? What would you do? Now, that is a very simple question. We're not
Mhm.
saying they get to decide or that we're turning over the decision making. We're just simply asking the question. So what happens? First of all, the act of asking that question shows respect. It shows respect that I understand your point of view is valid. It's likely different than mine. It shows that I don't find it threatening. I find it interesting and I want to hear it. So that's already a lot of progress. And then you listen. So when you listen, you will hear, let's imagine that you are the patriarch of the family business. You're going to hear a lot of things that are new, that you hadn't thought of before. You're going to hear ideas that are raw, right? That maybe there's something in there, but it's not fully cooked yet. You're going to hear things that you think are awful or wrong or you absolutely disagree with. But this is where we keep our opinions to ourselves. We hear it, we think about it, we can ask for clarification, right? Really think about it. And then to me, where we get to that sweet spot where we're collaborating and learning from one another instead of competing is we're open to where's the nugget in there. There's going to be a nugget. It's either something that I hadn't thought about or heard or didn't know about. And I can say, can we go back to that second thing you mentioned? Tell me more about that. Or I find the third idea you had really intriguing, but I have some questions. I'm concerned about budget, or do you think that our customers are going to, be open to that? Things that maybe you, as someone who's been around decades longer, have gone through an experience that younger person has not yet, right? That's a different kind of knowledge. But maybe they're telling you about an approach or a software or an experience they've had that you have not. And then you start asking questions in service of helping to refine that idea or vet that idea. And now we start learning from each other. And the thing that's really incredible is it works the other way. So if I am the daughter of, the 70-year-old patriarch of this organization, and I have thoughts, but I also know that typically the way it works is I'm not supposed to have the thoughts. I can lead with, well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And in listening, not only will I learn the same things that happened the other direction, we also sometimes at minimum will learn where their head is at. So if the person that's older in the organization starts saying all these sorts of things about AI that either I didn't realize they thought, or I'm not sure are true, or they are true and I hadn't even considered how that might be relevant. Now suddenly I'm learning where they're coming from. And I can ask questions. I can step in and share things I know that maybe they don't. And now suddenly we're collaborating. We're having two-way conversations. We've shown each other respect. And in both directions, that other person is much more willing to hear your point of view if you first ask to hear theirs. And you make it clear that you're asking in service of helping to move this forward. So I think that is probably, my favorite example. How would you approach this? Just to see where's your head is at. Because if I thought you were over here and you're over here, that alone is worth asking the question. And then this co-creation of, okay, I understand where you're coming from. I think I've kind of, now you know where I'm coming from. Let's have a third conversation. Given where we want to go, is there a way to blend both of these? Like, what are the best of both of these? Or how are you thinking differently now that you've heard where I'm coming from? Or what do we not know that we need to go out and figure out, given that this is the information or the skill sets that we have between us? So I think it's a matter of tackling the problem, right, as over here on the other side of the rope, and we're both over here with all these great strategies and tools unique to our perspective and lived experience. So I think it's about saying there's my view, your view, and then let's talk about our shared view of our standard or our norm or who we are as a business, and try to co-create that.
I absolutely love that example you gave. So we're coming to the top of the show, as I knew we would, very very quickly. So based on your experience, sort of to summarize, maybe your example, or maybe have another idea, is what's one piece of advice you could offer to generations as a group as they are learning to work and co-create together, based on your experience?
I think we want to view people across generations as opportunities for unique, non-redundant expertise and experience. If it's similar to any team where it'd be easier to work with you if you were just like me, but it wouldn't in the long run be very productive. We don't need 5 of me. I'm amazing, really, totally great, but we don't need 5 of me, right? We got me, so that's great. And recognize that of course it's going to be a little bumpy. It's going to be gritty if we see things different. But the whole entire point of a family business is we are bringing in different generations that have grown up in unique times and see things in different ways. And I think I'll maybe bring it to my most favorite metaphor, which is think of your family business as a house. That's the family house, and you have built that over many years, and that house is built on some load-bearing walls that are our values and our history and our mission and what makes us different. And we all agree those walls matter, and we want to protect those walls. Let's agree on what those walls are. And then there's going to be a lot of those walls in the house that aren't load bearing, right? Those are walls we put up 10 years ago or 20 years ago because that was trendy at the time, or it served a particular purpose that now it no longer does. And some of those walls, younger generations coming in are going to shake, right? They're going to shake all the walls and they're going to say, what's this for? Or we shouldn't do it this way anymore. And I think as a family, always being willing to say, well, is that a load bearing wall, or is that a non-load bearing wall? I love that language because I don't know what the load bearing and non-load bearing walls for every family and every business are. That's what they're experts in, but they have to know. Right? If it's something that our great grandparents put in place many years ago and it makes us who we are, then Gentelligence would say, let's teach that to the next generation. Let's have open, non-defensive conversations about why that matters in 2025 the way it did in 1925. Let's explain it. This is a generation that grew up with unlimited access to explanations and information. So now more than ever, if we want those things to sustain over time, we have to be willing to have that conversation about why that's a load-bearing wall. But we also, if we're going to evolve and be resilient and survive for another 100 years, have to be willing to say, not every wall in this house is precious. Not every wall needs to stay up or is still serving us. And our younger generation is valuable in part because they ask and they point out those walls that maybe we're still walking around that don't make sense anymore. And that's where this co-creation of being open to, well, that's a really good question. Maybe we don't need that wall there anymore. How would you do it? If we took down that wall, what would you do instead? I'm willing to have that conversation with you so that this house stays as strong as possible for a long time. And so I love that metaphor just because I think asking in a tense moment, do we think this is a load-bearing wall or not? Right? Are you going to defend that wall to the end, or is this something that's up for discussion and conversation and maybe needs to change over time? And I think that's really the crux of a lot of our generational tensions and maybe hopefully a helpful
That's great
concept.
advice. Load bearing wall, non load bearing wall. So Megan, thank you so much for your time. If people wanted to find you and reach out to you, how do they do that?
You can find me at gentelligence.org. That is the hub for all of our work. We have all of our resources, the book, access to our Gentelligence Academy, which is a digital online training program, speaking forums, all of those good things. So that is the best place to find us.
So Megan, thank you so much for taking your time. And audience, as you know, our guests donate their time because they care about you as the next gen of a family business. And, we created this podcast because it can be a very lonely place being part of a system like this, and wanted to create a community. And we're always looking for individuals that have subject matter experts or family members themselves so you can feel part of the community. So if anything that Megan spoke out to you or you want to reach out to her, please reach out, share the comments, let us know what you thought. But most importantly, share. Share with your peers, share with your friends so that they too can become part of this community. So Megan, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.